1947 until 1952, the Hooker Chemical Company used the Love Canal section of Niagara Falls as a dumping site for toxic waste.
President Carter declared a state of emergency today in the Love Canal area of New York's Niagara Falls, where toxic chemicals were discovered oozing from the ground.
In 1943, in Niagara Falls, New York, the Love Canal neighborhood was built on an old toxic waste dump site that was previously used by the Hooker Chemical Company. Resident complaints about birth defects and rashes led to an investigation by the Environmental Protection Agency. The toxic waste buried by Hooker Chemical was revealed, and an environmental emergency was filed by the EPA in 1978. However, only pregnant women and infants were evacuated, raising conflict with the other residents. The Love Canal Homeowners Association was created to aid in the two-year protests that followed. In 1980, the federal government finally compromised with the Love Canal Homeowners Association, and the remaining residents were granted money to leave. This event resulted in the ratification of Superfund in 1980, changed the environmental movement, and made citizens realize how the United States economic system puts profit over people.
The history of the Love Canal began when William T. Love proposed Model City in 1892. His idea was to dig a canal to connect the upper and lower Niagara River, creating a drop-off and the opportunity for the use of cheap hydroelectric power. The proposed city gained international support, but soon after the economic recession, an invention for cheap long-distance power transportation was invented, work on the project was halted. This left a huge partially dug canal behind, and in 1947, the Hooker Chemical Company bought the area and used it to dispose toxic waste. By 1952, 22,000 tons of mixed chemicals were placed in hundreds of thousands of metal drums that were buried in the partially dug canal and later covered with a clay cap. At this time, it was common practice to be irresponsible with waste disposal. This was due to the lack of laws regulating the issue and an underappreciated sense of hazards of chemicals in the ground.
At that time, there was way less government oversight. There was no Superfund at that point. The EPA was significantly less.
At the time of the dump's closure in 1952, the population of Niagara Falls had expanded dramatically. That meant a new school was needed, and to the local government, Hooker's property was an affordable location. Hooker refused to sell the land due to safety concerns and resisted persistent pressure. The local government threatened to condemn the Hooker chemical property in 1953, and with clear warnings about the underlying chemicals and a written disclaimer advising not to build there, the property was sold to the Niagara School Board for $1. The warnings didn't stop construction, and in 1954, a school was built and enrolled 410 students from 99 newly built homes that directly abutted the canal. This happened without either the school board or Hooker notifying the people about the toxic past that lay beneath the sprawling town. This was due to the lack of a law that allowed the landowners the right to know. The residents of the Love Canal lived for decades, not understanding the problem they were about to face.
The development of the Love Canal occurred against the backdrop of an evolving national environmental movement. In the middle of the 20th century, environmental awareness led to increased environmental activism and legislation. The best-selling book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson, derided the toxic effects of frequently used pesticides in the 1940s and 50s. The increased prevalence of smog in urban areas became a national concern in the 70s. Congress and Richard Nixon responded to popular demand by creating a slate of policies beginning with the National Environmental Policy Act that was effective on January 1, 1970. This act led to the creation of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, which primarily formed the Environmental Protection Agency in December of 1970. The EPA enforced congressional acts such as the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act to improve these environmental issues. Even with all the compromises that it took to pass those laws, it wasn't enough to prevent conflict of the soon-to-be-known Love Canal disaster.
The Love Canal was simply unfit as a container for hazardous substances, poor even by the standards of the day. By 1977, local authorities were belatedly finding that out. Several years of heavy snowfall and rain had filled the sparingly covered channel like a bathtub. The contents were overflowing at a frightening rate into the neighborhood. Residents reported pools of oil and colored liquids in their yards and basements. Families had long reported abnormalities such as birth defects and rashes in their children from an unknown origin. In 1978, after numerous resident complaints, the New York State Department of Health sampled the air, water, and soil of Love Canal and found 82 chemical compounds, including varieties such as dioxin that are known to cause cancer. In April of 1978, the New York State Department of Health started the extensive cleanup by digging up the chemicals buried in the ground at a cost of $98 million. An environmental emergency was filed by the Environmental Protection Agency, and only pregnant women and children under 2 years old were evacuated, leaving many concerned residents behind. Parents living in the Love Canal tried to get their children transferred out of the 99th Street School. However, the superintendent wouldn't allow it because other parents would likely follow and the school would have to close. Lois Gibbs, one of the concerned parents, started the Love Canal Parent movement in June of 1978. Protests sprung among Love Canal residents, the media covered it, and news was shown all around the country. The Love Canal Homeowners Association was established in August of 1978 to give the community a voice in the decisions made during the crisis. The Love Canal residents went to extreme measures to get out of the area, such as holding 2 EPA officials hostage in 1980 for 6 hours, and gave the president 4 days to relocate them. The residents leveraged their popularity to pressure Jimmy Carter 1 month before the 1980 presidential election to compromise with them and temporarily relocate all Love Canal families.
After residents finally obtained funding from the state to leave, 1,400 of them sued Hooker Chemical. The residential lawsuits addressed the side effects of the chemicals, including benign tumors, learning disabilities, birth defects, miscarriages, leukemia, double rows of teeth, and even death. Most residents won their cases, totaling to $20 million in settlements. What was still missing when they left the courtroom, however, was funding to study the chemicals of Love Canal, many of which still aren't understood today.
We have a good understanding of what the possible effects are. But there are emerging chemicals that we're still kind of working with and trying to understand what those potential effects are, or long-term effects.
An out-of-court settlement regarding the issue of who is financially responsible for the Love Canal disaster was reached June 21, 1994. Hooker Chemical agreed to reimburse New York State Department of Health the $94 million it took to remove the chemicals, and to take on cleanup work that would extend for decades.
The Love Canal resulted in the enacting of Superfund, the changing direction of the environmental movement through grassroots movements, and the realization that in some cases, the United States economic system puts profit over people. Superfund is a United States federal government program enacted in 1980 due to strong advocacy by the Love Canal homeowners. Superfund is designed to fund the cleanup of contaminated sites like Love Canal and hold responsible parties financially liable. Superfund remains in effect today, with thousands of sites across the U.S. and a current annual budget of $243 million. During the time of the Love Canal incident, transparency about the history of a purchased property was not required. The success of the Love Canal homeowners changed that. There is now a process stating that people have the right to know what the property is built on and they can decide accordingly. The Love Canal helped turn the already existing environmental movement into one more focused on local issues through grassroots movements.
Love Canal was sort of the poster child, if you will, of the initial start of this grassroots environmental movement.
Communities were inspired by Lois Gibbs' work and decided to fight for their rights too.
I can't tell you how many people have called us and talked to us about the inspiration that Lois provides to people around the country.
Noting this, citizens often need to strongly advocate for a slice of the limited Superfund budget, causing many to question the way our government works altogether. Alan Schneiberg of the Department of Sociology at Northwestern University said perhaps the legacy of the Love Canal is the need for rethinking our political structure and not just our voluntary non-governmental organizations. This could be due in part to the lack of a progressive political party, but also because in regards to the Love Canal, profit was put over people. Local governments must consider environmental issues when acquiring land because the best short-term deal doesn't always mean a long-term savings. As Lois Gibbs said, companies don't want to have to pay to get rid of toxic waste.
The lasting impact of the Love Canal disaster is Superfund, a federally funded mechanism for cleaning up hazardous sites, and an emboldened environmental movement through grassroots advocacy. It has also caused many to reflect upon how the United States economic system puts profit over people and our environment.
Oil wasted on the oceans and upon our seas, fish full of mercury.